Welcome to w.r.t Economics. In this podcast, I want to discuss how and why Europe's policymaking is led by emotion rather than reason. I want to discuss today's podcast into three sections. First, I want to just discuss, to lay out very briefly how emotion is taking over, or it actually has been taking over Europe's policymaking for the last few decades. And a prime example has been the events of the last week. Secondly, I want to discuss the mechanism why this has been so. And in short, it has something to do with PR and how overindulgence in PR actually can lead a lot of politicians to lose control of the entire political situation. And lastly, I want to present my views on how a more a more neutral or more rational way of policymaking could be in a democracy. But first of all, I want to apologize a bit because I mentioned in my previous podcast that I was going to talk about the relationship among several key Asian nations. And I still think it's a very important issue, and I will discuss that perhaps, hopefully, in my next podcast. I'm giving today's podcast a priority because I see that a lot of the new policies that have been introduced by the leadership, quote-unquote leadership, in the European Union during the weekend can be described as, in my opinion, completely emotional. And these are some of the policies that some of them, most of them, will regret, and I think the sufferings will be felt by the citizens who are unfortunately living in the European Union. So first things first, let me just talk about the emotions that has been driving the policies. Right? Let's just we can think about the energy policy, what Europe has been embarking on, built, as I have mentioned in one of my previous podcasts, right? Building windmills where there is no wind, and building solar farms when there is no sun, or not a lot of sun. This is completely driven by an ideology, but this ideology is amplified by I think by emotion that resonates in the population. And this has been one of the downfalls of the European Union. And in particular, we can see this in the weekend, in the last week, where essentially Europe has introduced economic policies that are completely opposing, or counter to its own interests, not only in terms of economic policy and energy policy, but also in terms of foreign policy. There's a lot of emotion that has been also propped up, propagated in the media, in the European media, no, undoubtedly under the guidance and under the blessing of a lot of the government officials who were enraged at the special military options, so quote unquote, right, that had taken place in Eastern Europe. So they were very much enraged because they thought, they were very confident that it would never have come to this step. And I must say personally, I was also surprised that it had come to this. But different people with different perspectives and the different tolerances for pain may have different opinions. And in particular, it is obvious in the sense that it already happened, that the Russian leadership have felt that the pressure against them had been so high that it is now or never. If they don't take some action now, they would have a weaker position in the future. And and this is in particular because we know that NATO has been building some military infrastructure in Ukraine, even though there are promises that Ukraine will not immediately join NATO, and I think these promises have been repeated by the American, the French, and the German leaders to the Russian leadership. But they felt that verbal promises did not correspond with the actions that could be observed on the ground. So they felt, okay, if we don't take an action now with essentially a military invasion of Ukraine, a single country, once the NATO has a military base there, if we want to take an action, then we will have to get into trouble with the entire NATO. That would be a much worse position. So why don't we make a move now? Now, I don't say that this is necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, and I just want to maintain a neutral stance in this analysis, in the analysis in this podcast, right? Because I want to be objective. I want to make some rational analysis rather than some emotional analysis, because we need to be mindful of the fact that this military action was merely, as I think Clausewitz said, an extension of diplomacy by other means, right? So that, I think, is basically the situation now. And we see that the European Union did what did they do? Well, they basically essentially also sanctioned. I thought that it would only be the United States that would sanction the Russians, but I think they also did, right? They also were very active in cutting Russian banks off of the SWIFT system, interbank messaging system. And a lot of the rhetoric coming out of Europe during the last few days involved things like launching economic warfare, launching hybrid warfare, and sending military equipment, and encouraging some citizens to join militias, and also to join basically an insurgency war, and I think also sending planes and directly to fly to send planes to. I think there were talks about sending planes to Poland and use Poland as an air base to engage Russia militarily. Now, all of these talks are highly irresponsible, highly motivated by emotion, and I think these are completely wrong types of actions, and I think the emotions are completely, fully unbefitting of leaders of any major power, and I think, in fact, not befitting of any leader of any country at all whatsoever. People who are making this type of irresponsible remarks, risking the entire world, getting the entire world into a World War III situation. These people are highly responsible, and I'm not the person that usually encourages this type of canceling culture, but I think these people are completely unsuitable. People who engage in this type of things, right? A good leader at this point should use reason, should try to de-escalate the situation, right? I personally don't think that war is ever a good solution, but to escalate a war, risking entire humanity, this is exceptionally dangerous, and I think these people should be ashamed. They should be ashamed of themselves. And of course, I'm not a European citizen, right? But if I have some power to dismiss some people, I will dismiss every one of these people who are making this type of highly emotional, escalatory calls, right? Let's just go over some of these, right? Let's say cut Russia out of the entire euro system. Whatever. I think does not really hurt Russia very much. You can seize their assets. Well, economically, it's going to hurt them a bit. But I think whoever is listening to this podcast, just go and check the exchange rate of the euro. What has happened to the euro after these politicians started talking about economic war with Russia? When they started talking about this type of hybrid warfare, what has happened to the euro? The euro crashed, and I think it will continue to crash because Europe is the most heavily indebted economy in the entire world, and it is also one of the most, I think it is the most stagnant economy in the entire world. And an economy that is stagnant, that is heavily indebted, right? That also has one of the world's, not one of the highest tax rates, completely inconducive to completely antagonistic to entrepreneurship. This type of highly bureaucratical economy, one of the only good things that they have is that euro is widely used. That euro is a currency that can be easily exchanged. Now you want to stop a major economy from using it, and you want to do all these things, and guess what? The rest of the world notices, and they realize, compared to the actions of the United States, they see that, okay, the United States at least respects the fact that they are a reserve currency and they have some responsibilities, that even though they have all these escalatory remarks, at the end of the day, they pull their punches. They don't go all the way in, because they know that if we go all the way in, too emotional, that would completely undermine the reserve currency status of the US dollar. And I think even what they have already done is already a lot. But the Europeans, these leaders, so-called leaders, they don't care. They seem not to care. They seem to want to crash the euro. And I would not be surprised that euro to the US dollar will fall below 1 very soon. I have seen just euro compared to the Chinese yuan had already fallen just in the last few days a few whole percentage points within half a week, and it has continued to fall, and I think it will continue to fall because as the economic situation worsens, there is very little hope of a recovery for Europe economically in the short to medium term. And then there are these talks about sending weapons, and I think they are already sending weapons to Russia, to Ukraine. All this does, okay, I don't like war, I don't want to see civilians die. But when you send weapons to Ukraine, what you are doing is you are making the war, you are prolonging the war in Ukraine, and you are making more civilians die. That's the only outcome. Now maybe you hate Russians so much, you say, hey, it doesn't matter if 100 Ukrainian civilians die, as long as one extra Russian soldiers can die. Maybe that is the way that you are your thought process is, but this is a highly immoral one. And the idea that Poland should be used as an air base to fight Russia, that is even more ridiculous. If that is to happen, there will be World War III, and with World War III, I think these people who are talking smack, they will pee in their pants, and I am very sorry to say, most of humanity will die, and that includes these so-called leaders who are talking smack now. So, okay, this is the situation. I said I wanted to present the situation very briefly, but I guess I got also a little bit carried away, and I rumbled on a bit too much. So I apologize again. Let's move on to the second part of today's podcast, which is the mechanism. I think here probably I can try to make it more condensed. The mechanism is, I think, quite simple. Basically, since I think just a few decades ago, in fact almost a century ago, people have learned from the Mussolinis and so on, that PR is a very important matter. If you can win the PR campaign, you can win a lot of public support. Doesn't matter how nonsensical your policy may be. If you can win the PR campaign, you can win public support, and this will keep you in office. And a lot of the European politicians continued on with this tradition, even though there had been, of course, a denazification after the Second World War. People continue to rely on the emotions of the public for their PRs. And this is where the emotion comes in. You see, first, they want to stoke up emotions. And the emotions are usually things about anger. Sometimes it's also about compassion. Right? It's these very extreme hate or love, this type of emotions, can really blind the public, can make it very difficult to the public to think rationally. And then, under these circumstances, the leader will then be able, as they think, to come in and present their solutions. But the problem that has, I think, got these things a bit out of control, I think, is social media. Right? I think the problem is that social media allowed the public to amplify their emotions amongst themselves much more than it used to be. In the past, it was a politician, right, with a controlled media, newspaper, radio, television, whatever, what have you. They give a piece, they give a sound bite, and they stoke up an emotion, and the public just get galvanized, and then the public support is gathered, and the policy is pushed through. This was the old way. Now, but they fail to realize, or maybe they realize, but it is still very difficult to control, even with full understanding of the situation. Right? When you continue to play this today, these emotions that you want to stoke up in the public is amplified by social media, via social media. And this can be such that it gets out of control. You want to promote a hate, and yet the hate is amplified by social media to such a degree that you have to change your policy to reflect the hate, otherwise the hate will be directed at you. The same with compassion. You want to promote a love for a certain group of people or certain activities, right? You want to plaster over all their flaws, and the people, the public, via the amplification of social media, get enamored with these groups of people that they think that they absolutely need to support it, right? They want to support it in such a way that they want to sacrifice themselves in doing so. Now, all this has led, I think, into the irrational energy policies in Europe, the irrational economic policies, and of course the irrational foreign policies. I don't want to go too much into the details, because I think people who have a bit, just any basic understanding of the irrationality in all those EU regulations and laws across European countries in general, they will be able to identify these issues. And I think if you go back, a lot of it can be traced back to these emotions. In sum, I think the EU or Europe in general is a feel-good party, right? But the problem is that after the party, when reality hits, you need to sober up, and you need to get rid of the emotions, and you need to resort to rational solutions. And what are some of the solutions to the situation? Well, this, I think, is the controversial part of today's podcast. If the first part is not controversial enough, I think this part is certainly going to be controversial. I think basically there are two things that can be done, but I am certain they will never be done, and that is just how it is. What are these two steps? First, I think there needs to be a representative democracy rather than a direct democracy. It has to be alienated from the emotions of social media, right? So there needs to be, basically direct policy discussions must not be involving the general public. They should only be involving people who are well informed and who are well experienced in the respective subjects. So you may say, okay, this does not sound like a dictatorship, authoritarian regime. Well, not necessarily, because you can still there are still ways to choose the appropriate representatives to complete these tasks. But then this goes to a second part, which is that democracy needs to be a privilege. Voting and getting the political rights needs to be a privilege, not a right. What does that mean? What I mean is that voting, in terms of voting, not everyone above the age of 18 should vote. You see, I've heard a few years ago when there are people who are Europhiles in Britain, they were talking about the fact that 16-year-olds were not allowed to participate in the referendum, the Brexit referendum. And they were crying. They said, "Oh, our future are going to be we're going to be destroyed, and we're going to be determined by a vote that we never we were not allowed to participate." How ridiculous is this idea? Now, how about 14-year-old? How about the ones that have yet to be born? The point about an age limit is that people who are too young don't understand, are not wise enough to understand the world. The world is a complicated place. It is not, as I said, a feel-good party. It is not about, getting drunk and partying all night. It is about the long-term hard decisions. And these decisions needs people who are well-informed, people who are really logical and rational, and people who are wise enough to appreciate the complexities of the world. So in my opinion, this should be people should be at least 30 years old, if not 40 years old, and they need to have certain amount of education, right? At least I would say, for example, with college degrees, and at least with some years of work experience in the real world before they are allowed to vote. Because otherwise, you are going to get votes by people who are completely clueless, and that is a vote that is guaranteed to not lead to a rational, optimal solution, outcome. And I think the right to participate for candidacy need also to be tied to qualifications. Everyone cannot be elected to some legislative bodies. Everyone cannot be elected to some administrative bodies. People need to have the appropriate experience, the appropriate knowledge before they are qualified to be elected. But this, I think, is just damn impossible. To this type of policy will be impossible to be implemented in any of the liberal democracies, not just the European ones. So I think there is no solution. Maybe one solution is to just outright get rid of social media. That will be one solution. Get rid of social media, at least there is no amplification effect. And perhaps the politicians will have more control, and maybe we'll get a little bit more rational policies, even though that would mean less participation, less political participation, and a weaker democracy still. Regarding the future of Europe, I've heard people say that this weekend marks and I'm going to name them. Basically, I've heard this from the w.r.t, which is a very interesting foreign policy podcast and channel on Rumble and Locals. They talk about this, and I think one remark that they made is that this weekend marked the inevitable decline of Western Europe. I have to say that in many respects, yes, I wouldn't use the word irrevocable. I think that's maybe that's the word that was used. It is reversible, but it is simply not going to be reversed. It won't be reversed because the current political class with the current political structure, basically using the mechanism that I mentioned before, is such that the situation can only worsen. They will continue to escalate the situation that are contradictory to their own interests, their own long-term interests. So I think that Europe, the Western Europe, will hit the bottom. I think the Eurozone will be dissolved, And I think the European Union, as it stands today, absolutely will cease to exist. But that is not a prediction of the complete disappearance of the EU. There are many different outcomes, and out of this type of the rebels, we may be able to see a revival, a renaissance of European civilization, but that it must be conditioned on the fact, is contingent on one simple fact, that World War III does not take place. If World War III takes place, as those European leaders apparently wish, then there will no more be a European civilization. I think there may be, in Latin America, in Africa, maybe even in Asia, there will be civilization maybe preserved. But Europe choosing itself to be the battlefield for World War III after leading the world to 2 world wars on its own continent, I think there will not be the fourth one. I think there is one, I think it was Albert Einstein once said, right? I don't know what weapons will be used to fight World War III, but World War IV will be fought with stones and sticks or something like that, rocks and sticks. And I think that is a distinct possibility, and we must prevent it from becoming a reality. Thanks for listening to today's podcast. I hope there are some interesting points that you find meaningful and perhaps that you can agree with. If you like this video or this podcast, do give me a thumbs up, subscribe and share. Make a comment if you liked, and have a great day.